thoughts, questions?
I know he spoke about being worried that he wouldn't be able to retain this understanding. Do we know that he has, and that this has been continually beneficial? That was really amazing to watch. Thank you for sharing.
We do. That was probably like 2007. And I actually spoke to Nick about a month ago about, I used to check with him every time I used the video, and he told me a few years ago, he trusted me to use my judgment and just to use it when I thought it was a serious purpose of people that were going to treat it with respect. So, but he's like everybody else, he's had challenges in his life, but he's doing well. His results lasted.
We have some questions from earlier regarding like generally about like the specifics of the treatments. First, someone asked, what's the metric for effect size? As in, what are you measuring specifically?
Okay, the effect size, I'm not a statistician, so some of you probably know more about this than I do, but the idea of there are two things that we mainly look at. The main thing the FDA cares about is the p-value, which is a measure, as a lot of you know, I'm sure, a measure of statistical significance. So the p-value, what was required by FDA, the lower the p-value, the stronger the results. So in our agreement with FDA for phase 3, for instance, which we're not releasing any results from phase 3 yet, but we will soon. The agreement was we had to have a p-value of 0.05 or less. In the phase 2, we only had p-values much lower than that, much stronger result than that. But then that's the thing that FDA actually requires, is meeting that p-value for approval. But it's hard to compare results across studies with p-values because anyway, without getting lost in the weeds that I would probably get too confused myself, it's a measure of the effect divided by the variation, basically. So if you had results that are all over the map, you'd have a lower, even if you had a certain p-value, you'd have a lower effect size because it would be variable. So it's not considered, it's the more consistent, the larger the effect size. So that's basically, it's to kind of correct for the variation. So, a medium effect size is 0.5. So with effect size, it's the opposite. The larger, the better. With p-value, it's the lower, the better. So effect size of 0.5 is considered moderate. And most psychiatric drugs are a small to medium effect size. Zoloft got approval with small effect size for PTSD. Paxil had one failed study, one small and one medium. So that's the range that a lot of drugs get approved on. And our effect sizes have been large, which is, 0.8, 0.9, 1 is large. And then some of them have been very large. So sorry, that was a little bit convoluted, but I hope that helps.
Sure. Cool. Another question is by Audrey, which I'm sure a lot of us can relate to, the sentiment of is that I was always taught in high school health class that MDMA permanently changes your brain's ability to produce serotonin even after one time. Is that true, and has that been a factor in any of these trials? Also, how do you walk patients through the come down period?
The brain's ability to do what? I missed a little bit of what you said.
The brain's ability to produce serotonin even after one time.
Yeah, no, that is not true. Temporarily, you might have a little more trouble producing serotonin if you've used up the precursors. But no, we're not finding any evidence of anything like that. And I don't want to, suggest that MDMA, can't be dangerous or doesn't have any side effects. We don't. One thing we don't know is, our studies have shown a really good safety profile, but it's been a limited number of times. The most administrations we've had is 6. Usually it's been 3. So, if you get into frequent higher doses, it gets more complicated. There's more doubt about some of the results, but for this range of use intermittently, we're not finding any evidence of anything like that. So I don't want to, be dismissive about the dangers, because all drugs have risks, but I also want to be clear that there was a lot of misinformation put out there, like all those, when Oprah had the holes in the brain images, that was just, that was lying. That was changes in regional blood flow with the gain turned all the way up and pretending it was like anatomical changes. So, very sadly, a lot of people genuinely thought they must have holes in their brain from taking ecstasy, and that just was completely false. Those scare tactics.
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of discussion of that in this class last semester and in the chat right now.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you said something about the come down. It's pretty interesting. We're well aware of the phenomenon. I don't know, Blue Monday, or I'm not sure what the latest terms are, but for people feeling down. And I've even heard psychiatrists say they thought maybe MDMA caused depression, but we actually have not seen that in our clinical trials. We've not seen actually, when we measured every day for the week afterwards, low mood, checked on mood, the incidence of low mood was greater in the people that had inactive placebo the week after than it was in the people that had MDMA with the same therapy. So it does not appear, we don't know everything. I don't have a full explanation for why people can feel down afterwards, because obviously that does happen. But I think there are several things about that. One is what else you're doing when you're taking the MDMA. And also, what are you actually taking? Those are factors. But I think my guess is that part of it is unresolved psychological stuff that's been trying to come up during the MDMA session and didn't get processed. Because we often notice one of the reasons for the integration session is people sometimes have kind of a backlash. They process things in the MDMA session, and the next day they might start doubting whether that was really okay to talk about, reveal what they revealed, or they may have processed a lot of painful material with the MDMA kind of holding the emotions somewhat at bay. And then the emotions that go, the grief or the rage or anxiety, can come up the next day or that week as a result of what they've been processing. But what we find is if we prepare people for that possibility, then when it does happen, they can check in with us and we help them explore what's going on. What they find is, this is more of my process. This was actually not just after effects of MDMA. It was unresolved process. Not to say people tend to feel kind of washed out and tired. It does take a toll on the body, and certainly people can have all kinds of emotions afterwards, but it doesn't appear that there's like some phenomenon of running out of serotonin, therefore you're depressed afterwards. We're just not seeing that.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying that. It's a lot of
thanks for the question.
um
I wonder, is Annie here yet? I guess she's not. Okay, she'll be on shortly.
okay. Cool.
Hopefully.
There's a couple more questions about the specific therapeutic practices. One is they're interested in how a session like this is conducted, because in that video they showed like at various times throughout he takes off the mask and discusses the experiences with the therapist. So like, is this sort of session entirely self-directed, or are the therapists checking in at regular intervals?
We check in every hour. That's part of the protocol. And I think it's good to check in periodically. But, you know, it really varies. Sometimes we've had some sessions where we check in every hour and the person lets us know that they're doing okay and that they don't have anything that they feel ready to talk about or need to talk about. And we just say, great, let us know if you need anything. So sometimes that's all there is, checking in an hour. That's kind of one extreme. And then, you know, we will find out more about what happened later. But part of the relatively non-directive approach is we don't feel that we need to necessarily know what's going on. We don't want to interrupt people if they're in a deep process. We do want to know enough to know that they're doing okay and that they're actually in a deep process that they're handling well. You know, people could be quiet for hours, and if we didn't check in, they might be kind of suffering in silence and really needing some support. But if they're doing okay, and we have enough information to know that they're having a significant process and they're handling it well, then we stay out of the way. So it really varies. Some people talk a lot of the time, and in general, I'd say maybe half and half, but we do think for most of the time, it's really good to have some interaction, some quiet time, but sometimes, you know, it's much more one than the other.
Cool. For another practice, people are curious about holotropic practices, since you mentioned that briefly.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's kind of another point about what I was saying initially. This is not just about drugs, it's about tools for helping people access these holotropic states and these healing potentials. And so, you know, when Stan Grof couldn't use LSD anymore in his research in Maryland, he went to Esalen to be scholar in residence. And that's when he realized there were lots of other ways of reaching this state. And that's when, he and his wife, Christina, developed holotropic breathwork, which is, you know, kind of taking elements that other cultures have used for shifting consciousness, you know, music, rhythmic music, breathing, vigorous breathing, conducive set and setting. So I think, you know, for me and Annie, I think holotropic breathwork has been one of the most helpful preparations for doing this kind of work, because you get to have that experience yourself. For one thing, you can learn that how deeply you can connect with these states without any drugs at all. That's kind of a nice thing to realize too, even if the drugs also are very useful. So I encourage anyone to try. You're in the Bay Area where there's plenty of access to holotropic breathwork. Stacia, who's here, is a part of the Grof training team, who's on loan to help me because of COVID, basically. So I think it's a really powerful tool. I encourage anybody that has an interest to check it out. Do you want to say anything more about that, Stacia?
I think you covered it. I've been trying to work to get Annie to join you, and
Oh, good. I was going to ask you.
She may be just coming into the room and joining you there, because the link, we were having some troubles with the link. So I'm sorry, I missed the conversation entirely.
Oh,
I think
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you did a good job, and yeah.
Thanks. Well, I'm glad Annie's going to come in. Yeah, she was going to take it from the other room so that Miles could be out there with her, but Miles will probably be cool as long as Annie's here.
He might come in and whine a little bit.
So Annie,
Hi, everyone.
you were introduced in the beginning, even though you weren't here.
Lovely to have you. We were just talking about some specifics of different therapeutic practices. One being the formal sessions as well as the holotropic work. Yeah, so I was about to follow that up with another question. Oh, let me find it. Oh, sorry. Okay, someone in the live stream chat asks, what they say that Alexander Shulgin, David Nichols, and Leo Zeff were the pioneers of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. It would be interesting to hear how, if at all, the current research differs from the likes of Shulgin's.
What was the last part of the question? I'm sorry.
How it differs
Oh, how it differs.
from the Shulgins.
That's a great question. It's certainly all part of the same kind of tradition in many ways. Ann Shulgin, I never saw her work. We saw her recently on Zoom, but she talked a lot about doing shadow work, and she had a lot of grounding Gestalt, but I think there's a lot of similarity. So I'm not sure about the details of Ann's work. I do know that some of our teachers worked with Leo Zeff, and my understanding is, so I think we've learned a lot that's been taken from what Leo Zeff learned and taught, although I think my understanding is he would invite people to bring in pictures and be a little more, have more of an agenda in some ways, but I think there's a lot of overlap. And Dave Nichols, Dave, you said Dave, right? Is that the other person you mentioned?
Yes.
Yeah, well, Dave's a fantastic chemist, but not a therapist. So he doesn't do therapy. But I think it was Dave that suggested the entactogen term, as I remember.
And probably our integration sessions, we don't really know what their integration sessions were like, but maybe the integration sessions are different just because of how we've been trained, maybe. Although there's probably some overlap.
Yeah, I'd say probably like there's a lot in that whole line of ways of working, and then there are a lot of there was Groff influence throughout, but we're kind of more heavily weighted on the Groff influence than we are on the influence by those people, maybe, but I'm not sure exactly.
Cool. Now for some more questions that are more student-led. So people have their hands raised. So Eli, would you like to ask your question?
You're muted, Eli.
Thank you, Noah. Yeah, so I was going to ask about the clinical trial participants and those for whom their effects lasted for a long time afterwards versus it seemed like there was a small number of people whose effects didn't last afterwards. I was just wondering if subjectively you came across differences in practices or attitudes or different factors that seemed like they might be associated with those differences.
Yeah, our impression is that the people who responded initially and then relapsed, it tended to be mostly psychosocial, the weight of terrible psychosocial situations they went back to. We actually did a small relapse study after the first study. We had 2 people who had relapsed. The follow-up I briefly mentioned for that first study was 17 to 74 months later. It was a separate study. So it was an average of 3.5 years later. So the 2 people that had relapsed, there were 2 out of 20 who had relapsed at 3.5 years. Neither of them relapsed for the first year, in talking to them afterwards, but eventually their situation was just so shitty that they relapsed. We got permission to give them one more MDMA session, and their symptoms levels went way back down. They responded to one session just as they had to the original 3 sessions. But then we did a 1-year follow-up from that, and they'd relapsed again. But there was actually a third person who relapsed after the long-term follow-up study that we included, who didn't have as bad a psychosocial situation, and her benefit was sustained more at 1 year than the other 2 that had the worst psychosocial situation. So I think it's obviously going to be a lot of different reasons, but I think that's going to be a lot of the reason.
And, thinking about PTSD and the toll it takes on people, if they have the 2 participants that relapsed that Michael was talking about, had PTSD for at least 10 years. And, by that time, getting another job when you've gone through so many different jobs, and also all of your relationships have suffered from the PTSD. So I think a lot of it is that, and just how we give out disability and what there is for people as far as help. There were churches that helped one of the people, but just I think that's like the broad issue of like what's available for people that have suffered for so long with disability. And the third person relapsed because of the media attention to her. She had agreed to talk to the media, and then that really caused her a lot of relapse from her for her PTSD.
Yeah, we didn't have time to talk about it. We did a small study with couples where we could give MDMA to both people, even though only one had PTSD. It was just 6 couples with promising results. So that would be, thinking about the people that went back to the bad psychosocial situation. What if they'd had at least a partner who had been treated, in the study with them, and they'd been treated together? Because obviously the partner is going to be majorly affected by the PTSD, and also maybe partly cause of the PTSD. So maybe that's one way to address that, along with the global hope to get these people more psychosocial help. But
Right.
Maybe if you had one other person that they did it with, it would be more sustainable benefit.
Yeah, the support. Great question.
Thank you very much.
Also, I think Akil's had their hand up for a cool minute if they'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks. This was really helpful, and I love learning more about MDMA. So I had 2 really quick questions. So the first one is, do you think that it has similar effects in a preventative state, like giving it to people before they go to war in case they get PTSD or other cases like that?
I think that would be really interesting. Maybe they decide not to go. A lot of them, that wouldn't be bad either. But yeah, we've talked to the veterans. They've all said not that. That's an interesting idea before, but they all said this should be part of like debriefing when you get back. Maybe if I'd had, because a lot of them, the veterans from Iraq had it for 10 years, some of them. They said, what if we could have had this right when we got back? I think that could have saved me all these years of suffering. So,
And what about if it was with some of the people they had been with, part of their unit? It could have been like a group experience for coming back.
Awesome, thanks. And the second question I had was, I'm not sure if you've had experience with other psychedelics, given that most of your research was MDMA, but I was wondering how, if any ways that you think MDMA differs from other psychedelics. Because personally, I've had experiences similar to like what the video showed in some ways, and some were different. So I was just wondering if there was like a more objective or quantifiable way of expressing that?
Yeah, clearly there is a lot of overlap and considerable differences. I don't know any way to, I'm not aware of anybody kind of looking at it in a quantitative way. Other than one thing we did do a direct comparison with psilocybin is, they developed the States of Consciousness questionnaire at Johns Hopkins years ago when Stan Groff was there, actually, I think. But for using with classic psychedelics. And they've, and it's a scale that, there's a cutoff score that they say signifies a full-blown mystical experience. I think it's above 0.6 or something. So what they found with most of their psilocybin studies, although it's not holding out in all of them recently, apparently, but they found in some of their studies that the benefit, the outcome correlated a lot with the, correlated strongly with the, whether or not they had a full-blown mystical experience. If they had a full-blown mystical experience, they were more apt to have a lot of benefit. So we didn't do it in the first study, but in the VET study, with veterans and first responders, we used the States of Consciousness questionnaire. And what we found was people didn't reach that threshold as often with MDMA. It was about a third with MDMA, where it was more than 2/3, I think, with psilocybin. And for the people that had the mystical experience, we think it was very important for their particular process, but whether or not they had it did not correlate with outcome. People who had no mystical experience still did just as well on their PTSD scores. They just had a different kind of process. So that kind of points to how variable it can be, but it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of process.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cool. With a little bit under 20 minutes left, we can go on to the people who prepared questions beforehand. Arjun already has their hand up, so we can start there and then see if Jordan, John, Celeste, or Vidur would like to go next.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you once again for coming in and talking to us about this. This was like really, really cool research I had no idea about before, and it was really enlightening to hear you talk about it. My question was, as we've learned, MDMA is an empathogen, which like basically means people are more comfortable and willing to share emotions that they have while they're on the drug. I was wondering, like, I've heard like in an informal and recreational context that people almost find it like unable to like not be able to go up to even like random strangers and express like their emotions about how much they appreciate or love them. And I was just wondering, are the feelings that people expressed on MDMA a result of the drug giving them the confidence to be able to express emotions that they have but were too nervous to say before? Or does the drug in a sense like artificially create these emotions, which like makes these people want to like express their gratitude and appreciation for anyone?
Wow, thanks. What a great question. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I mean, we can both answer it. I think that it in the people that we've seen, I think it removes the obstacles for them really being honest about how they're feeling and expressing things. I think we have, like Michael may have mentioned, the idea of internal family systems, and just that idea that we have parts of ourselves that may limit our willingness to share those deep emotions. And I think it tends to let people give them confidence to talk about their emotions. It also sometimes, in our studies, it kind of regresses some people so that they have more of the kid-like emotions that they share. And which they probably wouldn't do just in, normal encounters. What do you think, honey?
Yeah, I think I definitely don't think it creates emotions that aren't real. We've never had anybody that I can recall
No.
say later, no, that wasn't really true. That was just the drug.
Yeah.
And that was an artificial feeling. We've had people say, I can't reach that feeling anymore. I wish I could, or something like that. But we've never had anybody decide that they were not valid feelings. I think what it does bring up is the value of, well, in the words of the late Tav Sparks, who was one of the leading teachers with Stan Groff, keep it vertical. Meaning, if you're going to work with these kinds of states, there's a lot of value in keeping it on this plane: spirit, mind, heart, soul, earth, your own inner process. Don't act it out on the horizontal plane. So I think it's not that the feelings were not valid, it's that the execution was not so skillful or necessarily a great idea, and is really can be a distraction from just being with the process. So that's the value of preparation and that kind of setting and support. People you can talk to about what you're feeling if you want to talk, but you don't have to act it out with people that may not know what you're doing.
Alrighty, thank you so much. Yeah, honestly, when I began to ask the question in the first place after listening to the research you presented, I kind of assumed that it wouldn't be artificially created, because obviously I feel like the impacts that people have gotten from the therapy, from MDMA assisted therapy, if it was artificial, the results wouldn't have been long lasting. So that makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
And, it also helps people talk about what is honestly happening. Like if, for instance, if I were, and this happened a few times, if I were to say something that wasn't true for them, it's much easier for them to say, no, that's not the way it is. Or, or they might say the next day, that really bothered me, because that I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to talk to my stepmother. So it gives people the willingness to really talk about hard things too, not just love and connection, but really the ability to stay with that process of really working through whatever that problem may have been that in what you said, or like a repair in that relationship.
Yeah, it's pretty forgiving for the therapist. We can say something that was irrelevant or not helpful at all, and people just let us know, but they don't, it's not like a big rupture. Usually they're just like, frankly, no, that's not it at all. And then you move on.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Did anyone else that prepared questions for today, would you like to go?
I wouldn't mind asking my question.
Go for it.
That's all right. So MDMA is oftentimes grouped with other substances under the term club drugs, whereas alcohol almost never is. And I just want to know what you guys thought about that term, because another a chemist that I follow who does research with psychoactive substances went on a long Twitter rant about how he hates the phrase club drugs. So I just want to know what you all thought.
Yeah, I don't like it. It sounds more like a location than a description of a compound to me. So I don't really get what the value of that is. These can all be used in very different ways in very different settings. So yeah, I think that's kind of a misleading term.
Do you think it's at all or go ahead.
What do you think?
What do I think?
Yeah.
I think it's damaging to the general rhetoric around just substance use in general, recreational or therapeutic settings. I think it's basically nonsense. But I was wondering if you all had any insight on whether or not you think rhetoric like this in general is damaging to the research community, or in what way it is, if you think that.
Well, for the research community, I don't think it's really damaging anymore. I think it was an obstacle in the beginning. there was a lot of headwinds, but MDMA had a lot of baggage, kind of at first made it hard. Once we started to get data published in reputable journals, it hasn't been a problem for the research. Where I think it's a problem is like people that aren't trained medically who are trying to make sense of these drugs and whether they want to take them and what it's all about. Misinformation and that kind of unhelpful way of talking about them, I think is damaging because people are trying to understand and it gives them inaccurate information, which is, as you know, I'm sure, that's such a huge problem with the prohibition, with the drug war, is that people don't get the information they actually need to make smart decisions for themselves.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. I had a question. I was wondering what indications, if there's any indications coming up in the future that you're really excited about, or like is there other indications that you haven't had a chance to work on or that you daydream about? You know what I mean? Like, where's the cool research going to go?
I definitely know what you mean. Thanks. Yeah. Well, I think there are lots of exciting things to look into. MAPS is already, we've had some limited number of studies in other indications. Phil Wolfson and Julian Andres up in San Anselmo did a phase 2 trial, MAPS sponsored trial with people, MDMA assisted therapy for people with anxiety associated with life-threatening illness. Some people with cancer or other life-threatening illnesses, and that was promising. Charlie Grove and Alicia Danforth at UCLA did a study treating adults on the autism spectrum with social anxiety disorder, and that looked helpful. A study is about to start with eating disorders. And
we're hoping that there'll be a study for depression because it did look like we had people had less depression in our studies.
Yeah, we had robust decreases in depression scores in all the studies we looked at that with.
I'd love to see it being used with hospice or people who have illnesses and talking to their families about their illnesses. What about helping some of the healthcare workers that have worked with COVID and what they've gone through?
And that's probably going to happen. We actually have a new department, in the last 6 months at MAPS, which I'm the medical lead for, of investigator-initiated trials, because now we're getting people from all over the world. We've got more than 40 requests of people that want to use MAPS MDMA to do their own kinds of studies into other things. And they range from like tinnitus. Somebody in New Zealand wants to study tinnitus. There are quite a few with PTSD, but there are others. Somebody at Columbia University in New York wants to study MDMA with schizophrenia. And so there are lots of varied and interesting ideas for studies coming up. So I think it's going to explode. I think there are probably lots of indications that are going to pan out.
And more couples work.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. We're really excited about more couples work when that can happen. And group therapy. Chris Stauffer, who used to be at UCSF, he's now up in Portland. We're working with him about a group study for veterans. So yeah, a lot of is coming out.
Do you think there would ever be a role for like non-medical applications like language immersion or some sort of educational process or something like that?
Absolutely. That's a little bit more of a stretch for the FDA at this point, but yeah, I think to think that this is only good for people with serious psychiatric illness really doesn't make much sense to me. But that's more of a cultural shift and a regulatory shift that we hope will come along. And of course, Hopkins, there's some movement in that direction. Hopkins did the study with religious leaders, priests and imams and rabbis and other religious people taking psilocybin just to see what they thought of the spiritual experience. So they got permission for that. So it can happen. And we got permission to give MDMA to the partner of the people with PTSD. So I think we're creeping in that direction. I don't know how long it's going to take to get there.
Thanks, John.
There's an organization started by Bob Jesse called the Council of Spiritual Practices that you may know of. And that's, their mission is they support some of the other research too, but they're more interested in psychedelics for the betterment of well people, which I think is a damn good idea.
So we have a couple more questions that people came in with. I'm not sure if we have time for that. If you'd like to stay a couple minutes over.
Fine with us.
Okay, awesome. So would Celeste like to ask their question?
Hi. So first of all, I found the research and everything that you've been working on so enlightening, because I never really heard of like psychotherapy uses with MDMA because of all the heavy discourse surrounding it as a club drug. So this whole talk is like very, very exciting for me and very engaging. So thank you for everything that you've been doing within this field. I think you kind of already touched on my question, but I was going to ask if you think like there is a future for MDMA to be used more towards like regular checkups with people that don't have as serious like mental problems as like PTSD, or like something that is like very, very like big and like long term. Like, do you think people would be benefiting from it if they just used it like normally or like regularly with their therapist?
I think it depends how regularly and on the details, but I think, yeah, I don't see why it wouldn't be a helpful thing to use periodically in therapy, even if you didn't have one of these serious diagnoses. I do think one important point is to realize that you want plenty of time for integration. And it's important not to get over-focused on the drug.
Yeah.
And because then I think you can really miss the chance for the full benefit, because integration is such a huge thing and can take time after a session. So an example, just to give you an example of part of the reason I think this, one of the veterans who had, 3 full dose sessions, she had 3 low dose kind of active placebo sessions first, and then she had 3 full dose sessions, and she had really, really bad PTSD. And she was considerably better after three sessions, but still suffering a lot. And she wished she could have another session. And we also wished she could have another session, but it wasn't part of the protocol. And we actually probably could have gotten permission for it, but then that would have messed up the whole study, because other veterans would have heard that you could get another session if you had a high CAP score. So we couldn't do it. So we had to, she actually told us she felt as if we'd taken her 3/4 of the way up a river in a speedboat and left her on the bank. And we kind of felt that way too, actually. But all we could say is, well, we're not going to leave you on the bank, but we might have to row from here. But what happened was, but we also, had always told people it's not just about the MDMA, it'll keep unfolding. If you do things to support your process, you can keep working with this process without more MDMA. We always made that point. We were forced by this circumstance to trust that our own advice. And what we saw was over the next year, she had remarkable healing in other ways.
Yeah, she did meditation. She went to meditation groups. She traveled, which she had loved before she got PTSD. And so it may have been a little bit slower, but she ended up doing really well, making lots of changes in her life that she was hoping to do. And it was the catalyst that helped her do that, the MDMA.
And that's been at least 4 or 5 years. And I spoke to her recently too, because we've been rechecking with everybody about informed consent for our training video. So she was doing very well too. So not to say that maybe it would have been good to have a 4th session. And maybe if it was post-approval, that would be helpful, judiciously, but it's a really important point to not think you always need more MDMA or more psilocybin or more LSD. Maybe you need more integration along with that.
Yeah, so it seems like the way you want to think of the substance is more so as like a Kickstarter to help people start that introspection and like state of mind to be able to actually understand their experiences better. And then from there, hopefully they carry that on into future like therapy or like meditation or whatever they do.
Yeah. And, we asked people in the long-term follow-up questionnaires what they thought about more sessions. And many people said, I think another one in 6 months or a year to help consolidate things would have been helpful. So that kind of thing might be very helpful. I'm not implying that it should only be a Kickstarter and you never want to use it again. But I am saying strongly, it's only sparingly and intermittently that you want to use the medicine. You want to make sure you're incorporating it in other ways, what you're learning.
Great. Thank you so much for delving into that more and explaining that.
Thanks for bringing it up.
Thank you.
Really big
Thanks,
point.
Celeste.
I think, so since it's just past 3, we have one quick announcement before we can go up to like the, so round up. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to let all of the students know that we're starting office hours this week, and those are going to be on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. And there's a link for them sent out in announcements, and that'll be posted on the syllabus too. But they should be really sweet. Hope to see you guys there.
Awesome. Thanks, Eli. Okay. One last question from Vidar. It seems like it's a good way to round it up about, well, he can tell you. Go for it.
I had a question written down, but I was hoping I could take a little different approach. I was interested in learning more about holotropic breathing and how it connects to the preparation for therapy with MDMA, like you mentioned. So I was hoping you could kind of talk about that a little bit.
You want to say something?
Well, I guess for the preparation for the sessions, we usually go through some of the experiences people might have. And so using Stan's, some of Stan's work and describing some of the experiences, like energy in your body or changes in perception or transpersonal spiritual experiences, body having hot and cold. You might revisit some of your past just like you would in regular therapy. So there is kind of that, and also some of the probably what Michael has already talked about, but like being in the present moment and things like that. So we don't use more breathing because there's the MDMA. We do use breathing in a way so that people, well, we do in a way, we do suggest that they use their breath and find a place in their body where they're feeling things and breathe into that place in their body and see if there's tension. So that does come from holotropic breathwork. We use music to support it and eyes closed to have an inner experience. So there are those similarities in having the sitter. I mean, having two sitters, which are the therapists. What else?
Yeah, I think that holotropic breathwork sessions can be a great preparation for this, because it gives people a hang of the idea of staying with the process. It gives people, in a way, holotropic breathwork involves the body in a way even more than MDMA or LSD or psilocybin might. So, but that all of them involve the body, and it's really useful to pay attention to and work with the body. So people who've done holotropic breathwork already have kind of the hang of that to some extent.
Mhm.
And I think, kind of relating to Celeste's question, after you've had some MDMA sessions during integration period, periodically doing a holotropic breathwork session could be a great way of dropping back in and working more with integrating and extending that experience. I mean, we haven't done it lately, well, with COVID, but even before that, it'd been a few years that we'd had time. But over the years, we've continued to go do our own holotropic breathwork when we can, at least a few times a year, because I always find a lot of stuff is built up in my body and my emotions, and it's always a useful thing.
And often we would suggest for the participants in our studies to find a breathwork group, because it's such a nice way to connect with other people who've had these kinds of experiences, and a community that supports non-ordinary state work. And
yeah,
so,
after they'd finished the study, we
right,
didn't do it.
after they finish the study. Yeah.
But yeah, that's another point that I'm glad you brought up, Annie, that, one of the things that Stan and other teachers always talk to us about is, in our culture, most people do not understand anything about the value of non-ordinary states for serious healing and growth and spiritual work or any of that. So when you have these deep experiences, and then you go back into a culture that thinks what you've just been doing is either irrelevant, crazy, or dangerous, that's part of the preparation, is to prepare people for that and try to encourage or help them find a community of people that do understand what they've been going through. So, we always talk to people about that, be mindful who you share this with. You're going to have this experience that's going to be close to your heart. You may be very enthusiastic about sharing it, but be mindful of who you share it with. And it makes me think of a cartoon that Stan drew with a naked yogi hanging upside down from a tree limb. And down below, there's a guy being taken away to the mental hospital by the men in little white coats. See, they've got him in a straitjacket and they're loading him into the ambulance. And he looks up at the yogi and says, "They call you a yogi and they call me a crazy man. What's the difference?" And the yogi looks down and says, "The difference is a yogi is somebody who knows who not to talk to."
Angry.
And with that,
So remember who not to talk to, please.
are there any other last parting wisdoms you'd like to leave us with?
Yes. Well, a lot of appreciation for your enthusiasm and for inviting us. And we need you. This is exploding. This psychedelic research is going to change our culture. It is changing our culture. It's going to change psychiatry and psychology. It's happening, and it's going to take a lot of skilled and educated people to carry this effort forward. So we are counting on you to keep on this job and help us carry it forward. So really, it's always exciting to see bright young people who have the potential to do something with this.
Nice to be a part of your class.